and welcome to our last podcast in the series from the Making and Learning Institute coming out of Marymount School of New York. I'm Don Buckley and I'm the co-host of this podcast series with Eric Walters. Let me quickly give you some background on the Making and Learning Institute. It was a professional development institute started at Marymount School of New York with funding from the Edward E. Ford Foundation. And the big idea, it's on its fourth year, was to really try and reimagine the professional development experience for teachers. What other things could we do besides conferences? Each year, Eric and I have sort of redesigned the format of the Making and Learning Institute. It's gone from innovation coaching to student-led sessions, to talks to parents, to half-day immersion experiences. And this year, we wanted to try a new channel, which was the podcast, and see how that might work out in terms of professional development. But so far in the Institute, we've had 500 people come through it from about 100 schools. It grows year by year. And so this is our fourth iteration of the podcast. And it simply runs where we bring someone on. And tonight we're really thrilled to have Dorothy Lee from the Windward School. Dorothy will tell us a story, to tell us some work that she did. And actually that work is already published in the Making and Learning journal. This was an idea that Eric and I had where how do you give a platform to teachers to display their great work? And often teachers present at conferences and we thought, well, why not give them somewhere to publish? So what we do is we crowdsource articles in the making and design area and publish them in this format. This is volume 2. Volume 3 is about to come out, and Dorothy actually has a story in this called Experience Empire Through Artifact, a 9th grade project. So welcome, Dorothy. Thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll kick off by you giving us your presentation when you're ready, and then we'll jump right into a conversation and a deeper dive about it. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you guys for having me, and thank you guys for all the work that goes behind this, as well as the publication. We really enjoyed our participating in that. So let me just share my screen here and get us started. Okay,
all right.
Let me know. Are you guys able to see my presentation right now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I guess just to give a little bit of background about where I'm coming from, Windward School is a 7 through 12 independent school. We've got approximately 600 students, and working with older students and a makerspace on campus, the expectations have often been, I find, different from my colleagues at other schools that are working with elementary students and middle school students. So just keep in mind that some of the work I'm going to talk about is skewed in that direction. But the idea behind the replicate, realize, and revamp thing is really just, it was a selfish thing. I wanted some way to kind of organize in my mind reasons why Maker Ed is valuable in content-specific classrooms. So we'll talk about that. So it's about the integration of Maker Ed and how it can enhance that content-specific learning. So I thought of these 3 guiding perspectives. I'm called to say they're the only ones, but just 3 of them. So there was replicate, and I'm going to give an example from a history class to illustrate that. Realize, and I'll use a science project to illustrate that. And revamp. So for that, I've got a social justice and civic engagement project. So as director of the makerspace on campus, as well as the maker program in general at the school, I often work with faculty to develop projects, and my involvement in those projects often, it can vary. So I'll talk about two projects, the first two that I had a lot of involvement in. I actually worked with the teacher from the ground up to develop it. And the last, I was more tangentially involved, but it was just such a great example, I wanted to share it. So for Replicate, this is actually referring to that article that is in from Prototype to Pitch. And the project we called Experiencing Empire Through Artifact Replication. So basically it was a 9th grade history class where they were studying one of the Indian empires, the Gupta Empire. And the project basically was aimed to have the students pick an artifact from the Gupta Empire and recreate it. And I'll talk a little bit about the value gained from this experience afterwards. So they researched a specific artifact. The other next phase was that they worked with me and our resident tinkerer to determine what the best way to recreate this artifact would be. The goal was to choose methods that would mimic the authentic process as much as possible. Then they created the replicas. And finally, they presented their work in a gallery walk. And for that, they also needed to create an augmented reality sort of narration piece to that. And for that, they used Erasma. So there were several people involved in this. And you can see from these photos, these are some examples of the students' work in progress. So here are some more photos of work in progress, but it was really awesome to see how dedicated and committed the students were to this project. I think at first when they heard they were coming into the Create Studio or Makerspace to do this, they were thinking, oh, we're going to be 3D printing stuff, cool. And they were kind of surprised when we told them that, nope, that's not allowed. And so in the end, when they struggled with carving molds and in order to cast things or just shaping sculptures or you know, working with these materials that often many of them hadn't touched before, they developed a pretty deep and genuine understanding of the process that went behind these artifacts, as well as an appreciation for the culture and the historical context. So the students in themselves, with their written reflections, really expressed that appreciation for this whole process. Okay, the second perspective was realize. And so the example I've got here is from our 8th grade science class, which I actually co-teach. And so I did this with my co-teacher. The students had to design an interactive museum exhibit using a Hummingbird, which in case you're unfamiliar is similar to an Arduino. It's a microcontroller, but much more user-friendly to start with. So for this project, the students were assumed not to have any coding experience. And we sort of structured it in a way where students who did have coding experience would have the room to experiment beyond the minimum. So we created a can-do checklist to begin with so that they learned how to use the basic features of Hummingbird by completing these tasks on the checklist. And those who finished quickly because they were more experienced had time to play around and try cooler things. After that, they needed to design the exhibit. So this was supposed to be a culminating project for our Earth Science unit. And so they needed to create an exhibit that clearly communicated at least one of those concepts. It needed to include a sensory input device that controlled an output. And the output needed to display at least 2 different types of behaviors. So it couldn't just be, you know, on and off. And finally, we did a gallery walk with our students and they got to see each other's work at the end, and they needed to include an exhibit information card to kind of give the user not only instructions on how to interact with their exhibit, but also to further explain the concept in case it wasn't fully explained by the visuals. So through this process of realization, we found that the students needed to first internalize the concepts, really fully understand them before they could reinterpret it and repackage it in order to make it physical, to actualize it. So here I've got I'm not sure if the video will work. Oh, I've got a short video of one of these projects in action. This one was illustrating volcano formation by hotspots. So essentially the students used some servo motors to move their platform to demonstrate how tectonic plates shift over a hotspot in the mantle, and the different volcanoes form when that occurs. In this example, uh-oh, I gotta go back. So this one, the students decided to create a model that illustrated the difference between in magma viscosity and what type of eruption style that would cause. So higher viscosity, lower temperatures, slower moving model on the left side, faster on the right. Yeah, and so they were using some rotary sensors here, essentially dials and some motors. Okay, and third, the perspective called revamping. The example I chose, there are so many that I could have chosen, but I was really impressed with the vision of this project. This was for a social justice and civic engagement capstone for our seniors. And essentially, they used the design thinking process to address a particular issue in society, specifically in our own city of Los Angeles. So there are a number of initiatives that our current mayor has, and addressing homelessness is one of them. And they looked at 4 aspects of that issue: employment, housing, health, and relationships. And first, they studied the issue as a whole class to really understand the context of it, historical, economic, social, to really get a deeper understanding of all that. And then in groups, they chose one of those 4 areas to focus on in order to look at a client, I'll say. So as I'm sure you guys know, in design thinking, having a client in mind is really important, and often it's hard to find a genuine client for these processes. We find it's easy to kind of come up with some made up story or some character that we can design for. But oftentimes it's hard to find an actual human being to interview. And so I thought one of the genius parts of this process was the teacher found a resource online. She used On the Streets in LA, but the photos that I have here are screenshots from a website called Invisible People. And essentially these websites have video interviews with various people experiencing homelessness. And so these interviews are sort of a stepping stone for our students to see what a meaningful interview can look like, how to talk to people who are experiencing difficult situations without, without throwing them out into the field before they've had time to kind of grapple with this entire process and understand how that works. So the project in general, after they chose one of those videos, they formed a client profile, basic information, any issues or interesting facts that they could elicit from that. Then they did more targeted research based on their person. They needed to interview some community organization, a person from a community organization. And they formed need statements based on that. They got feedback from their peers at that point before continuing on to the brainstorming portion. And of course, prototyping, that's where I had most of my involvement. And then finally, they had another presentation with feedback at the end as well. Unfortunately, I couldn't find photos of their actual projects, and the teacher's on break, so I didn't want to bother her. But the photo of the garden I have here is similar to one of the ideas one of the groups came up with. They decided that employment and community are things that people experiencing homelessness are often wanting, of course. But the idea of forming a community where they could work together and live off the fruits of their own labor as a community, that was something that I thought was quite interesting. The photo below of this movable portable tiny home. Again, just an example, but one of the groups came up with their own version of this. And in their example, the tiny home could be something that the person might be able to sort of lift up and roll along themselves. And so through this revamping process, I'm calling it, the students first had to cultivate a really deep understanding of the existing conditions of whatever the issue was, in this case, homelessness. And from there, they were able to innovate some improvements. Okay, and so just to wrap up, these were the 3 perspectives and the value that I think the students gained from each of them. So that's it. I will bring you back. Okay.
Awesome.
Great. All right,
Great.
I'm back.
Yeah, fantastic, Dorothy. That's amazing. And I love the whole, the sort of the big arc of these 3 different projects that form part of the maker and design thinking movement. You know, I mean, it's so diverse what you just showed us, right? Starting with this, you know, almost like a 1.0 style project where it's history, but they're using, you know, craft type stuff, right? And then jumping onto the sort of electronic side, the more, you know, notching it up into electronics. And then of course, ultimately ending in the most complex of things, trying to solve for homelessness. But let's go back to the first one, which, because I read your piece in from Prototype to Pitch, and you mentioned, you talk about significance, how like that's important for the kids to actually understand this scenario that we're studying. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so the history teacher actually phrased that in a beautiful way, I think. So the idea was that, you know, history is one of those topics where it's really hard to get students to engage in often because it seems so far away from what is relevant to them. And historian or good student of history, you have to really care about that population or that time period, and you have to understand the significance. If you look at, let's say, a statue that's taken out of a temple, you know, for someone existing today, we might say, oh, it's beautiful, look at the master craftsmanship, and kind of leave it at that. But to really understand what that meant and how much it took and how many resources it took to create that, it really gives you a deeper appreciation for what role, let's say, the religious temple plays in that kind of culture, civilization.
Right, right. And, you know, what was also fascinating with that project is like pushing the kid to think about how these objects were made in the past with the sort of basic technologies that existed then, and that sort of maybe we don't use anymore, or would we do it very differently? So like, did you guys think about anything about that? Like, if it was made today, what would it be like versus the way it was made then?
Well, actually, that's an interesting point. We hadn't talked about it, but I think the way the students' minds worked kind of alludes to that a little bit. When we said that we were going to replicate something, they immediately thought of more current technologies, you know, which are great. And I think that there's some amazing things that we could do with current technologies, but it was really important us to have them experience these, let's say, more low-tech.
Yeah, no, and that's why I'm finding this fascinating, because I never thought about that, about, oh, like, if it is an old object, let's try and make it in that type of material. But I think that might be a fascinating thing, study, you know, like to make the object in different eras with what materials were available. And then what would it be? That's a great idea. What would it be in the future? You know, and it'd be, I mean, whatever it is, if it's a pot or a, you know, a cup, I don't know what it is, but it would be fascinating, and it would end up being a smart cup maybe that could, I don't know, whatever. But yeah, I mean, so, you know, thanks for getting me to think about this. It's fascinating, really is amazing.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of another project that we, sort of a similar iteration that we did the year before. We had students design monuments, historical monuments for a specific event. So in this case, it was the Roman slave rebellion. And they designed, the different groups designed a monument from a different perspective. So whether it was from the slave rebellion side or from the Roman side or from a modern historian side, the interpretations were different, but I think it would have also been interesting to work in this idea of different materials, to limit it based on the time period in which these would have been created. The other thought I had as you were saying that was, I think that often maker education these days naturally carries the connotation that we have to use current technologies, or that current technologies are the best option. And I think that gets away from the fundamental purpose of maker education, right? It's not about the technologies per se, it's about what we can do with it and what the experiences are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think low res prototypes are often, they're just not taken seriously. And it is so important for quick prototypes. But what I find as a pushback, Dorothy, and I don't know if you get this, but if you have faculty build out low-res prototypes, if they don't understand the idea of the prototype and iteration and feedback loop, it turns into like an arts and crafts thing. And I found a lot of resistance and pushback. Oh, well, this is just arts and crafts, Any thoughts on that, or have you found that in your work?
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that. And I think, especially, maybe it's an LA thing. People are really used to having the final presentation be very polished, and they want that final product to look impressive. And often low res prototyping doesn't come out that way, and that's not the purpose of it. And so I do find that sometimes that buy-in is not always there. I think it is really important to build in the time for whatever that project is for the feedback and iteration. My first couple experiences with design thinking at my school, I didn't get it myself because it felt like we were just going through this very standardized step-by-step process, and at the end we've got this cardboard mess of a thing, and that's it. And it seemed like the prototype itself was the end. I mean, it felt like that was the purpose of the whole thing. And I think that is something that our teachers are sometimes experiencing themselves. They get to this end prototype which doesn't look great, and they're like, well, what was the point of all this? I think they've missed it if they stop there. And it's a challenge, because oftentimes we've got a very short amount of time to do things, and it's hard to make more.
Yeah, it is. And so I guess, so there's a D school activity called the 5 chairs. Do you know that one?
Is that the one where you are designing for different characters?
The Simpson characters?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the thing, I use that a lot, but that's where I've noticed more where people start to think arts and crafts, because they get so wound up in designing the chair, they forget about the unmet needs that they're trying to solve for, which is comfort or flexibility or what have you. And what I find is that if you're not bringing them back to that unmet need, it turns out to be they're designing a chair, and then it turns into an arts and crafts. So that subtlety, to keep reminding them of that is tough, and I feel this is where a lot of those activities fall apart. They end up as an arts and crafts thing without you saying, well, we're talking about unmet needs. We're talking about unmet needs, and this is just a prototype to get feedback. And I think it's one of the hardest things to get.
And it's kind of easy to fall into that hole. Sorry, my audio cut out a little bit.
Yeah,
could you repeat that last?
Not saying it's very hard to keep faculty in the loop with that this is just an iteration and it's about solving for unmet needs and not designing a chair.
Right.
And of course the lack of understanding what a prototype is, which is about getting feedback. It's to really to put your idea into some form to get the feedback to improve. And I think it's a crucial step in the design process where just a lot of educators have a very tough time with, you know. So yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. But
it almost makes me feel like prototyping isn't worth it unless you're able to do something with the prototype after.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas what it's about is it's an iteration to get feedback to eventually come up with a solution. And I think that's often the big thing, is that even when people ideate, those ideas are assumed to be solutions, which they're not. They're ideas. And this gets lost in the process again. That you have to keep reminding people. But yeah, that's a great project. I have so many ideas about it now, because the other thing I'm thinking about this project is what's so fascinating, the way everyone runs to 3D printing. But the fact is, we can 3D print houses and cars and all this other stuff. You know what I mean now? And I mean, that's why now I'm thinking, oh, well, we used to make cars with this, and now we make cars with that. Eric, are we still on? I guess.
Yeah.
Because you just jumped back to your screen, I guess. I don't know why. But
I probably coughed or something. I don't know.
Yeah. But yeah, awesome project, Dorothy. So let's jump on to project 2 and talk a little bit more about that, because that's where you introduced, servos. You talked a bit about using the Hummingbird, and I agree with you. I think Arduino is tricky for middle schoolers. In fact, Eric's school, James Deck, who we did an Arduino project a couple of years back on autonomous cars, where they built out autonomous cars, which we use servo motors on Arduino to actually program them. The idea was that the students would not need driving licenses when they graduated, so let them understand about autonomous cars. But it was really tough. But James has now sort of developed it, and he's using the microbit. Do you know that? The microbit?
Yeah, I've heard of it. I haven't tested it out myself.
Yeah,
but yes.
Yeah, but it was like, what I picked up on you saying was that like you went with the Hummingbird because, again, you didn't want to get like bogged down in the technology of Arduino, right? And sort of that was the best choice.
Yeah, I think that with any microcontroller, there are two sides of it, right, that can be challenging for students. You've got the coding aspect, and then you've got the physical connecting things aspect of it. Right, and I think that Hummingbirds take out the struggles of the physical connection to some degree, so that the students aren't wasting their time trying to figure out, how to get it connected correctly. Microbits, I agree, also help in that respect because they're so much simpler.
Right, yeah. So it really is like trying to choose what's the right, in this case, like time before was what's the material, but here it's like, what are the bits of equipment we choose to actually, that work best for this project, and being mindful, of that.
Yeah, well, also the other side of it is we wanted the students to spend as little time as possible struggling with the technology and the coding, and also to reach a proficient level of coding for the purpose of the project. Again, I think there's vast value in Arduinos and other types of microcontrollers, but for this project, our main objective was to have the students thinking about the science concepts that we wanted them to, and figuring out how to make that understandable for an audience. So yes, they had to learn coding, and yes, they had to learn how to work with the machinery, but that very much should have been a second priority.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's like, what's the right technology for the content, and not letting the technology drive what you're trying to do, which happens a lot in technology, using, even if we move off of maker stuff and onto apps, or like just for the sake of it, makes absolutely no sense. But like making that distinction is so important for educators You know, like it's like picking the right book in an English class, right? You know, for the level of reader or whatever that is. And so about that project, Dorothy, you know, it was a museum exhibit, and you specifically, it was like a science museum. Was that the idea?
Yeah, we got our inspiration from, you know, Museum of Natural History, the California Institute of Science, which is a local one we have here. And if you go to a science museum exhibits, and we just wanted our students, we were hoping that we would actually be able to get a partnership with one of those science museums nearby. Didn't work out for this year, but we're going to try to get it rolling for next. Yeah, so we wanted that to become kind of a design what you think would help students like you understand the concepts that you're trying to convey.
Right, right. And then, so let's talk about the partnership thing, because that elevates it to such another level, right? In the classroom, where now you've got another institute and they're professionals, and these things take so much time, like as you well know, but like the value in it with the time that you put in, you know, you can't even compare it to anything, because that's what makes it totally real then for the students. We're still connected?
Absolutely. You know, I think if the students know that their work is going to be used somewhere and viewed by the public, their buy-in absolutely skyrockets. I was actually pleasantly surprised, even so, that without that extra carrot, once the students realized how accessible the technology itself was, again, kind of coming back to that idea that they were able to get to a level of proficiency quickly, and then say, yep, I know how to do it, I know how to do it. Just that confidence in itself really increased the student buy-in for the project. And so it was pretty amazing that that was able to drive them.
Right, right. And Dorothy, would the idea of the partnership be that you would have like a mini exhibition in the Science Museum? Would that be sort of the deliverable? Wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what we had envisioned was that we would be able to kind of
Ooh, I think we've lost.
I think she froze.
Yikes. Hopefully she can come back into us.
I wonder if she knows she's frozen.
Yeah.
Hold on one second.
That's interesting. It's the first time we've had that.
Oh, now she's gone.
At least she can come back in.
See, you jinxed it, Mr. Buckley. While we're waiting for Dorothy to come back, any of our participants, if you have questions for Mr. Buckley, you can type them in the chat box, or you can put your audio on and you can ask that way, or your camera on and you can ask that way as well.
Hi, this is Sari. I was interested in that last slide that Dorothy showed that kind of summarized the whole presentation. I'm hoping she'll come back and maybe we could see it again. It was on very quickly.
Yeah, that would, yeah, absolutely. That would be good to see.
I'm in elementary and I'm finding this very applicable to elementary as well.
Oh, well, that's good. Yeah, where do you teach?
I teach in the Valley, in North Hollywood area.
Oh, okay.
In Los Angeles.
Okay. And do you specifically teach maker stuff, or?
Well, we have a maker. I'm one of the administrators, and we have a big maker space. So we're always looking to. We're part of the D School this year, and we're trying to, you know, just really do things well.
Right, right. So what are you guys doing with the D School?
They're helping to train, we're doing teacher training on, how to think about design thinking as a person, and then how do you replicate it and work with students.
Okay, so they're doing a lot of the D-School activities then with you guys?
Yeah, and consulting with teachers, like teachers come up with projects, and then periodically the teachers come in and do a check-in with the D-School via video.
Right. Oh, that's great. They do amazing stuff at the D-School and produce amazing activities. And I guess you've seen, they have a wiki with all specific activities for K-12. Have you seen that one?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, so if you Google D-School K-12 wiki, a bunch, that's the one I'd mentioned to Dorothy, the 5 chairs is on there, but so many other ones that you can tackle at all different levels. There's even a great one called Reimagining the Morning Routine, which you can do.
We've done that one.
Yeah, that's like students love that one, but it totally is. That's a great one as well. But so if you know that one, there's a bunch of others on there that are, it's a great resource for your teachers. Definitely take a look, but just Google Design Thinking DK12 wiki and up it will come.
Okay. We did the design your morning with parents to get them to understand what it was we were doing.
That is another great one. Yeah. So Eric, have we lost Dorothy completely?
There's nothing on email and she's not back on yet. So I say we give her a couple of more minutes.
Okay.
And hopefully she pops back on because she had a lot of really great things to say.
Yeah, I know. And I really wanted to jump into number 3 with her since it is my area of expertise and dig a bit deeper into the homeless problem and how tricky that can be when you're working with kids.
I have a question. Is someone there to hear? How do they evaluate these projects? How are they evaluated and turned into the grades for the students at the end of that whatever time frame?
I'm guessing they have some sort of rubric. That's the norm, the way people do it, right, Eric? I mean, because you do projects like this, you can speak to it better than me, right?
Although I'm starting to get more and more disenchanted with rubrics because
yeah, me too. I mean, that's my frustration.
Every kid gets, a 3 or a 4.
Right.
You give them a 1, they're not happy with their 1. And hold on one second. I have an email from Miss Lee. Hold on.
Because she could just click on that link you sent her again, right?
Mm-hmm. Her internet cut out totally. She's trying to get it worked out.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to say we're going to wait.
Yeah, we're going to wait.
There's, not to brag, but in our 3rd publication, which will come out in the next 2 weeks, there's going to be a chapter in there on assessment. So as soon as it's ready, we'll certainly let people know. But it was done in collaboration with teachers in Nashville and teachers at Windward from last summer. So we just had a really sort of ongoing discussion about how do you assess a lot of these projects and how do you sort of move beyond the rubric. So it should be interesting.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hey, Dorothy, you're back.
You're back.
Hi, sorry. I'm actually tied in with my phone right now, so I've only got audio.
Okay.
Fine, it's fine.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No problem. Welcome back, Dorothy. So there was a question from the audience while you were away, which was about assessing these projects.
Mm-hmm. Any one in particular, or just the 3 of them in general?
Which one, Sarah? Shout.
It was just in general, because I know one of the pushbacks we've had with faculty is how do you assess them? How do you give them a grade at the end of this? Assuming it's taking a month, 2 months, a whole year for them to work on the project, and how does that translate into a grade?
Sure. Well, so I'll start by saying first that we're really fortunate our school allows us to set our own objectives and learning goals. And so at the very beginning of each of these projects, it's really important that I have a conversation with the teacher to figure out, okay, at the end of this day, what do you want the students to take away? Now, I'll get to how that plays into the grade in a second, but oftentimes it's not, it's not that I need them to memorize these facts. It's not that I need them to, know every little detail about this particular historical period. For instance, with the history project, the goal was really to have students deeply engage with the culture of a certain empire that existed hundreds of years ago. And so the rubric that we put together had different pieces for the research as well as the replica, but we structured the rubric so that the students were fulfilling certain requirements as opposed to how well they mastered a certain skill or, at the end of it. And I know that some administrators, some schools might not think that that is enough, but for us, it was really the student experience at the end of the day that was the most important part.
Yeah, but you know what, Sarah, that's a great question, because I think this is the elephant in the room, because like when you do this sort of work, which what Dorothy just describes, it's really, there isn't a grade that applies to it, but we're forced as educators to put a grade on it. I mean, a grade doesn't exist in the real world. And when you start to do projects that emulate that and you try and put a grade, it forces it. So we're stuck. But I know from experience what Eric's school have done with full courses, when they have sort of alternative courses, there is no grade, it's a pass-fail, right, Eric? And I guess that's deliberately why you guys do that, because what the message you're sending is, this isn't about a grade, it's about doing good or solving a problem. But I hear you, it is really tricky if you have this grade system and then you're trying to apply a grade to projects that Dorothy is talking about. And like you said, the rubric doesn't often work, And
the other thing is, like, how do you, if somebody's designing something, how do you assess like what it looks like? We have, when our students do the curators gallery, they have to design an exhibit for the Met. Well, I always look for, like, did they meet the requirements of the project, and are they demonstrating their knowledge in a way that's meaningful to them? But I'm not going to critique them if I don't like the way they designed it, as long as it makes sense. From a design perspective, I think that's good, but it's hard to critique a student's design because a lot of times that comes from them. And to try and give them outside feedback on that, I find really, really tough.
Actually, Eric, you're just reminding me of something, and maybe this would be interest to our guests. You had me judge one of your projects once, which was the social justice and physics one.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the way the kids were commenting on how some of the teachers were giving the feedback or grades that really upset them. Do you remember something like this? Because like they were all so awesome. I really couldn't flaw them. But do you remember any of the things that there was pushback with the kids? Because it was really funny. So
that project got retired for this year, just because it had come to sort of the end of its life cycle. So they get enough feedback from me. So when the students present their work, I always try and bring in other people to do the evaluation process. So we always had Dawn. We had our upper school head come in. We had venture capitalists come in. Don always gave the easiest grades. Like he'd give like 3 out of 3 on everything. And other people would give like 1 out of 3. And I never told the girls ahead of time, like, that their grade was determined by the guests in the room, not by me. And they got really mad because they're like, well, how come she gave me a 1? And the venture capitalist, who's a good friend of Marymount, she often gave the most specific and critical, and I don't mean critical in like negative, but the most thoughtful feedback, not that Dawn doesn't. because her push was always, you have one idea that does one thing. How can you sort of broaden that so that you're not just focused on like one solution to one problem, but how can you sort of make it multi-purpose? And the students often struggled with that. And that's usually where her comments, quote unquote, brought down the grade, was because she felt that the students' thinking was very linear and they didn't think of the possibilities that could go along with the project work that they had done.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, I think the grading thing is right. It's not just hard from the administration and school side of it, but from the students as well. They're used to being graded and they want the good grades, and understandably, because it's the reality and what they need. And I hope that by filtering in Maker Ed, starting from a young age, and design thinking and this very different mindset, that slowly we'll see our students coming in with a more accepting perspective on all of this. I feel like when we give them very clear expectations at the beginning of a project, it's often not enough, and that we have to continuously remind them throughout the process. We're not grading you on, how well you answered that one question or how nice the thing looks. Reminder, we're grading you on the thought that you put behind what that person told you and what they needed and whether you addressed it or not. So I absolutely agree. It's hard from various fronts.
And I would add to that I know Windward has been part of the maker movement for quite a long time now. We've been doing it for 6 years now. And I think we're now finally at a point where I'm a big proponent of giving the girls robust feedback. And I think we're starting to get to a point where the expectation of that feedback is more important than, am I going to get an A on this project? And that's been a long time coming, because you're battling a lot of cultural norms with the kids about their grades. And that's evidenced as well by the fact that they go into the makerspace to refine their project because they want to refine the project, not because they think they're going to get a better grade for it. And that just comes from conversation and talking to them.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Yeah, totally.
So we have about 5 minutes more for questions. If anybody has questions, you can certainly put your microphone on, and Dorothy would be happy to answer them.
I'm wondering if Dorothy could send us that last summary slide.
Right.
Since we can't see it.
Absolutely. I'm happy to publish the entire thing. So Eric and Don, just let me know how I can get that to you guys afterwards.
Absolutely. If you want to just send this presentation to us, we can share it out.
Okay, will do.
Thank you.
Dorothy, what's the time frame for some of these projects?
It varies. And so at the beginning of each project, I always ask the teacher, how much time are you able or willing to put up for this? Because knowing full well, some of these projects can take a long time. And I want the teacher to know that we will find a way to make it fit their needs and what they're able to give. So for example, the artifact project, we split it into chunks. They spent 1 week doing their research. They spent 1 week in the Create Studio, in the makerspace, actually creating the thing. And we weren't sure that would be enough time for them, but we made sure to look at the materials that they were using and the processes to try to anticipate whether that would be enough time for them or not. And I think all told, that project probably took about 3 weeks. But again, only one of those was for the physical making part of it. And a lot of the students came in during open studio hours outside of class time to continue working because they were just so into it. And so that really helped as well. The Hummingbird project for the museum exhibit, we crammed it in. We got it done in 2 weeks, and maybe it was a week and a half. We gave them 2 class periods for the introduction to Hummingbird and to complete that can-do checklist. They had maybe 3 or 4 class periods to create the actual thing, but we made it clear to them from the beginning that we were looking for a prototype. It didn't need to be fully polished. It didn't need to look fantastic. And so I think that helped. The idea that they just need to get it together and fully working and fully functioning, that was the priority. So we were able to get it done quicker. The design thinking project I know took several weeks because of how authentic the teacher wanted that process to be, the time spent connecting with outside organizations and interviewing and then researching and reworking, prototyping and presenting in between. That one took, I would say, probably 4 weeks.
Okay. I mean, that's where we struggle, is trying to get the right amount of time that there is in class to work on these projects, as well as coordinate down in the makerspace how many classes can actually be down there. Is there an overlap? Is there a physics class going in there, math and art classes? So we're trying to balance it, but yeah, it's always the time. I never feel like we have enough time.
Yeah, and I think that's just a struggle that everyone will always have till the end of time. And yeah, I think the best we can do is, you know, if you're working with other teachers, I'm always just trying to reassure them that, hey, to work with me and to work with the Makerspace, you do not have to give up a month of your class. If you're only able to give up a week, I will take it upon myself to figure out a way to make that worthwhile for your students.
Okay, good.
So just before, I'll let Dawn wrap up in a second, but Dorothy, I was wondering if you could talk about one of the premier professional development opportunities for folks in Los Angeles that's hosted by Windward every year.
Yeah, I would love to. And it's not just for folks in Los Angeles, but given the time of year, I know it might be hard for farther afield educators. On May 12th, which is a Saturday, we are running the Design and Maker Class Colloquium for the 4th year, I believe. And it's a one-day thing where we are having breakout sessions in the morning where educators share some of the work and inspiration that they've been doing this year. And then in the afternoon, we've got 2 rounds of hands-on workshops, and both of those rounds run for an hour and 45 minutes. So there's more time there to really get your hands on stuff. It's not just sitting down at a conference and listening and talking the whole time. You're actually able to get involved with some of the making technologies and projects that you hear about.
And I'll be there for my 4th year in a row, and I wouldn't be anywhere else. I think it's a fantastic event. I also just want to share that if you're going to be in the Bay Area at the end of June, Marymount and Castellea co-sponsor Design, Do, Discover. It's the dates escape me, but if you go to castellea.org, you can find out more information. That's another 2 days an immersion experience in their Maker Lab as well. And again,
yeah, and I can vouch for that one because I attended the one in New York a couple of years ago, and that one was fantastic. Thank
you. So 2 really great opportunities. So Dawn, I'm going to toss it back to you so we can wrap up.
Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and I'm going to leave you with my favorite feedback that I use all the time in teaching and encourage people. So this feedback is for Dorothy. I like the projects you're doing. They're awesome. I wish we had time to go into project 3 about homelessness. What if we do a solo podcast sometime in the future on that specific project alone, because I think it's so rich. But thank you.
That would be great. And I think that the teacher who implemented this in her class, and she would love to participate in that as well.
Okay, great. Awesome, awesome. So thank you again, Dorothy. This has been great. Thanks, Eric, for, as always, the man behind the curtain, making this thing work seamlessly. And for our guests. And I'll put it back to Eric. He'll tell you where you can find these conversations and when. But thanks again, and stay tuned for our next series of Maker Learning Institute podcasts.
Which will be in
Thank
September.
you both so much.
September. So we'll have this up on YouTube and SoundCloud by April 13th. I know Mr. Buckley's going to say, why can't you do it faster? But we're hosting a big STEM event at Marymount on Saturday, and that takes priority this week. So, and then you can find all the previous ones. The first 3 are all there as well. And we'll send out a link to both of them once they're posted. And as Dorothy as well, when she sends along the link to her presentation, we'll get that out to everybody too. And then don't forget, if you'd like to purchase From Prototype to Pitch, volumes 1 and 2, they are available on lulu.com. And then our 3rd volume is Disrupt and Innovate in the K-12 classroom. That should be out by April 20th. So they're also free downloads on issue if you so choose. Go to making.marymountnyc.org to find all that information.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and thanks again for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you and hear you back here soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Wonderful.